This time it's to the far southwest corner of Australia. It's twilight in the beachside garden near Albany in Western Australia.
My name's Steve Hopper. I'm Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Western Australia's Albany campus. And we're standing in our front yard at a place called Good Beach, which is on King George Sound.
Where are we? 400 kilometres south of Perth?
Yeah, we're very close to the southernmost part of WA on Torndirrup Peninsula, south of Albany town. A very famous place from the point of view of Australian history and exploration. This is where Vancouver landed in 1791. It's where the Flinders expedition first touched Australian soil. So literally within 2 kilometres of where we are, Tim, is where Robert Brown, the father of Australian botany, first set foot on the soil and first collected Australian plants.
Now, before we get to botany, you've been Director of Kings Park Botanic Garden at Perth. You were Director of Kew Gardens in London. You've also been, throughout that time and before and after that, working on a whole range of books and publications on the Australian flora, but particularly with a focus on this region. So it is the plants that drew you back here? The
plants, the country, family. This is, to me, like heaven and earth in terms of someone interested in field biology. This precinct around Albany sits on the edge of a global biodiversity hotspot.
It's a tremendous place, and we can hear the sea in the background, and we're in your garden here, your private garden. So out beyond, of course, is the amazing West Australian flora. But there's a genus I know you've worked a lot on, and I don't know whether we're going to see any of those in here or not, but the kangaroo paws. Do you have any of those in this garden here?
I sure do. We're just coming upon a central area, wall to wall, with 7 different species of kangaroo paw. And I've been interested in, since my PhD 40 years ago, in the kangaroo paws as a model group to try and get at the question of how has the flora of southwestern Australia ended up with so many species when the place is relatively flat as a landscape. There's relatively few mountains, the Stirling Range, but most of the southwest is this gently rising plateau, and yet it's the second richest temperate flora on the planet, second to the Cape region of South Africa as far as I'm aware. So why is it so? How could you end up with this tremendous diversity? Kangaroo paws are only found in southwestern Australia. In a native sense, they're planted all over the world now, in the horticultural palette of Mediterranean climates in particular. When I started, there were 8 or 9 species recognised. I named a new one. We've done recent DNA work with colleagues at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and discovered there's 2 more new undescribed species here on the south coast. And one of the features that kangaroo paws differ in is the height of the flowering scape. So you get lots of little fellas that are called cat's paws or dwarf kangaroo paws, that sort of thing. And then the state floral emblem, the red and green kangaroo paw, is higher. It's about 1 metre high compared to 30 centimetres. And what I discovered in my PhD with a colleague looking at honeyeaters was the smaller ones, the honeyeaters stand on the ground to get the nectar, and the bigger ones, like the red and green kangaroo paw, they perch on the stem. And at one place called Gingin Cemetery, where 2 species were coexisting with a few hybrids, common cat's paw and the red and green kangaroo paw, they differ in their flowering peak by a month. So in August, cat's paws are peaking, and the honeyeaters spent 97% of their time on the ground. Even if there was a red and green kangaroo paw above them, they wouldn't jump up onto that. They'd stay on the ground and just feed on cat's paws for 97% of the movements. A month later, when the red and green kangaroo paws were peaking and the cat's paws were running out of steam, they would do the reverse. 97% of the time they'd be perched on the kangaroo paw stems, and they would hop or fly to the next red and green kangaroo paw, even if there was a flowering cat's paw down at ground level.
So you've got 2 plants very closely associated with their pollinators, which is not an unusual thing. Well, in orchids, I know you've done a lot of work on the same thing happens there. And take us back to how this explains the diversity of the flora in southwest Western Australia.
What's going on is the plants are working out how they can ensure that their pollen mostly goes onto individuals of their own species by having differential height. So they're playing on the fact that the birds want to expend most of the time as least amount of energy as possible in getting their food, the nectar from the flowers. So it makes a lot of sense. If you've got a predominant ground-flowering species, you stay on the ground and you ignore that thing that's up higher, because that's a lot more energy to fly or jump up and land on it than it is just hopping along the ground to the next catspaw. So if you like, the plants have worked that out in a metaphorical way. I'm not suggesting they've got consciousness, but through natural selection, you get these dwarf things and taller things for perch feeding. And as we started looking at the West Australian flora, you find the same thing. There are prostrate banksias, for example, and there are shrubby or tree banksias. There are prostrate grevilleas, and there are shrubby or tree grevilleas. Prostrate verticordias, and it goes on and on. All, I think, doing the same thing. So it's an example of how, even though the number of pollinators might be limited, you can end up being different species and getting more or less exclusive pollinator service by varying your floral attributes.
Well, as always, Stephen, it's probably just whetted my appetite for a few more questions, but we better leave it there. This is Professor Stephen Hopper at Good Bay and looking at some kangaroo paws, but hearing a lot about the wonderful West Australian flora. Thanks very much, Steve.
Great pleasure, Tim.
And all that from an incredibly pretty garden. And I have to say the beach in the native bushland just outside was absolutely breathtaking there near Albany in Western Australia.